Billy Harburg, an American police officer, found a newborn in a trash can and saved its life. 25 years later, when he was no longer a police officer, he received an unexpected phone call that would change his life forever. Billy was born and raised in Oregon. He had always been an open-hearted person and very determined in everything he set out to do. As a teenager, he was a curious and active boy. Even though he lived in a big city like Portland, he spent a good part of his time exploring trails and walking through the region's parks and woods. He had an impressive courage to venture into the forest, even finding rivers and waterfalls. However, Billy had a great fear of encountering a bear along the way. When he finished high school, his parents told him it was time to choose a career. Billy had no doubts. He wanted to be a police officer. He was never a guy who liked guns or dreamed of participating in shootouts with criminals. His interest was in protecting the community and the people around him. Billy wanted to make a difference, but without hurting anyone. However, he knew that as a police officer, he would also have to take direct actions against ill-intentioned people. Even so, he didn't abandon his ideals. He learned to shoot, to identify different types of drugs, and studied legislation thoroughly. Billy always tried to approach people in the most correct way possible. During the rigorous training at the police academy, he followed all the instructions to the letter. What Billy didn't know was that life was about to test his vocation to help people in an extreme and unforgettable way. Years passed, and Billy Harburg continued working on the streets. He did routine patrols, participated in investigations related to drug dealing, and occasionally chased criminals through neighborhoods. However, the day that would change everything for the officer started like any other. That morning, Billy left the police station driving his patrol car. He cruised through some Portland neighborhoods slowly, alert to any movement. Suddenly, as he entered a residential area, he heard an unusual sound that caught his attention. At that time of day, the neighborhood was almost deserted, as most of the residents had gone to work. On alert, he decided to follow the sound, which grew louder and clearer as he approached. To investigate better, Billy parked the car and got out, walking calmly and precisely in search of the source of the noise. He didn't know what he might find, but something told him that the situation was serious. The sound led him to a corner known for being dangerous due to drug trafficking and gang rivalries. It was precisely the area's notorious history that made the officer even more worried. As he walked through the neighborhood, he kept his hand near his holster, praying he wouldn't have to draw his weapon. He was tense, feeling that anything could happen at any moment. Turning the corner, he saw a group of people visibly distressed. As soon as they saw Billy, they rushed toward him, all speaking at once and trying to explain what was happening. Among the group, a woman, already with tears in her eyes, pointed to a trash can just a few meters away. Billy walked in the indicated direction, initially thinking it was a drug stash. However, as he got closer, he realized the sound he had heard earlier wasn't what he expected. At first, he thought it might be a cat, but as he approached, he was sure the situation was even more serious. It was the cry of a baby. The newborn was inside the trash can, surrounded by garbage bags and blowflies. Billy was shocked. It was the first time he had encountered a child in such a state. He began to wonder why those people hadn't removed the baby from there. The child was extremely weak, but still had enough strength to cry, which was an important sign. There was still a chance to save him. The officer couldn't believe what he was seeing and could only think about how anyone could be so cruel as to abandon a defenseless creature in such a terrible situation. Throughout his career, Billy had dealt with real-life stories of people leaving babies at fire stations, giving them up for adoption, or even taking them to orphanages. But in a trash can? This was the first time. Taking a deep breath, he gathered his thoughts and began to act. While the baby cried, Billy carefully removed the trash that covered the fragile body and, with great care, picked the child up in his arms. Although the baby still had vital signs, Billy noticed something was wrong. The boy was breathing slower than normal, which was concerning. It might have been the result of the time spent suffocated under the trash. Without wasting any time, Billy called for emergency services, and while waiting for the ambulance to arrive, he kept the baby warm and secure in his arms. He never let go of the child for a single moment. A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Even with a team of nurses and paramedics ready to care for the baby, Billy felt he couldn't leave him alone again. He looked at the little boy, who seemed calmer now, and followed what his heart told him. He climbed into the ambulance with the rescue team and went with them to the hospital, never taking his eyes off the child. During the ride, an idea came to his mind. The baby needed a name. He could no longer deal with the situation without giving the boy an identity. Gabriel, he thought. A name that meant purity and sweetness, like an angel. Although he wasn't a religious man, Billy felt that the name suited the little one perfectly. At the hospital, the doctors conducted several tests to ensure the baby was fine. That was just the beginning of a story that would mark Billy's life forever. What Billy feared most was that Gabriel had contracted some illness from being left in the trash for so long. Fortunately, despite everything, no signs of illness or serious symptoms were found. The doctor only pointed out some redness on the boy's back, which could be an allergic reaction. It was very hard for the officer to leave Gabriel alone at the hospital while he returned to his home and family. However, as long as the baby was under medical supervision, he knew he would be safe. Even so, Billy made a point of following the case closely, calling every day to check on Gabriel's condition. Little by little, the boy gained strength and regained his health. The city's social workers took over the case, and soon after, Gabriel was chosen for adoption by a young couple, Mary and James Wood. They lived in the city of Eugene, south of Portland, and were enchanted by the boy as soon as they met him. Of course, they were also deeply moved by his abandonment story. During the adoption process, the couple learned that Billy Harburg had been the officer who found Gabriel and that it was he who had given the baby his name. Mary and James liked the name so much that they decided to keep it, which made Billy extremely happy. Although relieved to know that Gabriel would find a home so quickly, the officer felt a pang of sadness for not being able to see him every day at the hospital. Visiting the boy had made him feel connected to Gabriel and also responsible for him. Gabriel grew up in a home full of love and care. Mary and James, his adoptive parents, never hid from him that he had been adopted. Gabriel did not become a bitter or traumatized person because of his early rejection, but from time to time, he would find himself wondering what could have led someone to abandon him in a trash can on the outskirts of a large city. This thought deeply bothered him. No matter how many different scenarios Gabriel imagined, none of these hypotheses were enough to satisfy his curiosity. Mary and James knew that this question might never be answered, but they wanted to find a way to comfort their son's heart and mind. One day, they decided to contact the Portland police and ask about Billy. That's when they learned that the officer was no longer part of the force. After the incident with Gabriel, Billy had requested a transfer and become a park ranger for the state of Oregon. In a way, the encounter with the baby had awakened in him the desire to work in a type of law enforcement more connected to his lifestyle. Mary and James remembered Billy's dedication and how he performed his duty with care to ensure Gabriel's protection and recovery. After some persistence, they managed to get a contact through Captain Phillips, now retired but still knowing the whereabouts of his former colleague. Phillips commented, "Billy was always more of a social worker than a cop, but I think now he's happier with the animals in the woods, helping tourists and adventurers, far away from the dirty world of crime." After this conversation, the captain provided Billy's contact information for his new role. He also mentioned that the former officer had never forgotten what happened that day and often wondered about Gabriel's fate after his adoption. With the number in hand, Mary and James reached out to Billy and arranged a meeting at a cabin near a national park where he worked. When Gabriel learned, he was thrilled to finally meet the person who had pulled him from the trash and saved his life. But at the same time, he felt nervous. He wanted to understand why Billy had cared so much about him. Finally, the day of the reunion arrived. Billy was deeply moved to see Gabriel grown and healthy, so different from the fragile baby he had rescued years ago. He explained to the young man and his parents that he had never had children, and the closest he ever came to that paternal experience was when he first held Gabriel in his arms. "I know it might sound silly, but in that moment, something changed in me. For a brief moment, I felt what a father must feel in the desperation of seeing his child in danger," Billy said, with tears in his eyes. Gabriel, moved by Billy's words, gave the former officer a tight hug and said that he needed to thank him in person for everything he had done. During the embrace, the young man took the opportunity to open up. He shared that he had a strong desire to find his biological mother, not to judge her, but to forgive her personally. He asked if Billy knew anything about his past that could help him locate her. At that moment, Billy's smile disappeared, and his expression turned serious. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "I tried to investigate who your mother could be. Back then, we searched all the maternity hospitals in Portland, reviewing the records of women who had given birth in the 2 or 3 months before you were found. But my efforts were blocked by Captain Phillips. He told me that if I wanted to fix the world, I should go after real criminals." Billy paused and continued, his voice tinged with sadness. "It's because of cases like this that I ended up leaving the force. It's been so long, Gabriel. I don't know if it would be possible to trace anything now." Gabriel was saddened by the response. The thought that he might never find his biological mother deeply affected him. Still, he thanked Billy for his honesty and the effort he had put in years ago. At the end of the meeting, before they said goodbye, Gabriel and Billy exchanged contact information and promised to meet whenever possible. Little did Gabriel know that, shortly after, he would receive an unbelievable piece of news. Billy realized how important it was for Gabriel to know his biological mother and decided to take action. He requested a week off from his duties as a park ranger and resumed the investigation he had abandoned 16 years earlier. He knew it would be a difficult task, but he wasn't starting from scratch. Much of the case's information was still kept in an old personal file. Determined, Billy began calling all the maternity hospitals in Portland, requesting birth records from that time. Not all the hospitals had properly organized records from that period, which forced Billy to make do with the documents that were sent. Moreover, he would need to rely on luck. Fortunately, among the records he received, there was enough information to help him. He quickly dismissed the files of women who had given birth with their husbands or partners, as those circumstances didn't match Gabriel's case. Billy spent 2 full days going through the files and another day making phone calls. It was around 9 in the evening on a Thursday when a relevant piece of information came up, the name of a woman called Lillian Hitler. She had given birth almost 2 months before Gabriel was found in the trash. Out of all the files that had survived time, this seemed to be the most promising lead. Without wasting time, Billy contacted Mary and James Wood. He explained that Lillian lived somewhere near Cottage Grove, maybe in the middle of a forest, and that they would need to go there to try to talk to her since there was no phone record in her name. Mary and James were shocked by the discovery, especially because Cottage Grove was just a few miles from where they lived. If the information was true, it meant that Gabriel had grown up practically next to his biological mother, without ever knowing her and without any idea that she could be so close. The next day, Billy and Gabriel set off in their truck. Together, they traveled dirt roads and crossed streams until they reached a small village of cabins, inhabited by workers from the region's timber industry. After asking some locals, they were able to locate Lillian Hitler's house. When they knocked on the door, a woman in her 30s, holding a cigarette and with a suspicious look, answered. She gave Gabriel a long stare before saying anything. Billy introduced himself as a forest ranger and former Portland police officer, explaining that he wanted to know if she had lived in the city about 16 years ago. The woman confirmed, but said she hoped she would never have to remember Portland or what she had experienced there. Intrigued, Billy asked if she could share what had happened. It was then that Lillian, visibly shaken, confessed. "I was a horrible person. If I live as a poor widow in this godforsaken place, it's because I deserve it. I cursed myself, sir. God didn't wait for me to die to punish me." Curious and concerned, Billy gently pressed on. "Lillian, did any of the things you did in the past involve a baby?" As soon as she heard the question, Lillian's eyes filled with tears. Trembling, she knelt down and began to cry uncontrollably. "It's finally my time. You can arrest me, officer. I knew we would pay for what we did. I knew." Billy, surprised by her reaction, tried to calm her down. "Please, ma'am, calm down. What do you mean by we would pay? Who was we?" Breathing heavily, Lillian explained. At 18, she had married Jeremy, a man who, over time, completely changed after starting to work in the timber industry. When Jeremy found out Lillian was pregnant, he not only showed unhappiness but also began to suspect that the child wasn't his. Throughout the pregnancy, Lillian went through hell, facing daily threats. Jeremy would say he would leave her or not let her leave the house. He frequently insisted that she have an abortion, saying he wouldn't raise another man's child. Despite her fear, Lillian held on to the hope that, upon seeing the baby, Jeremy would recognize the similarities between them and change his behavior. Maybe, she thought, they could go back to being the loving couple they once were. But when the boy was born, nothing of that sort happened. On the contrary, Jeremy even forbade Lillian from registering the child with his last name. As the days went by, Jeremy became even more paranoid. One night, while Lillian and the baby were sleeping, he stole the child. When Lillian returned home without the baby, she panicked and tried to call the police. However, Jeremy threatened her with a knife and coldly said it was too late to worry. He told her he had done what she hadn't had the courage to do when he demanded the abortion, and ordered her to leave the city as soon as possible. A year later, Jeremy died in a work accident at the sawmill, which brought some relief to Lillian, who had lived under constant threats. However, the guilt for not being able to protect her son consumed her. She developed deep depression and, for years, couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened to the boy. "Everything I live today is a curse, officer. A curse for a crime I let happen to an innocent child. Now you're here to arrest me." By this point in the story, Lillian was crying non-stop. Gabriel, equally moved, could not hold back his tears either. Billy stepped forward, placed his hands on her shoulders, and said firmly, "No one is going to arrest you, Lillian. Now take a deep breath and listen to what I'm going to say. No one is here for games. I found your son 16 years ago, and he's here now to meet you." Lillian lifted her head and looked at Gabriel once again, in disbelief. She was in shock, not knowing what to do or think. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, they embraced. After 16 years of pain and regret, mother and son were reunited. The last time Lillian had seen Gabriel, he was just a helpless newborn. Now, looking at the young man in front of her, she could hardly believe it. "I survived, Mom." "I survived," Gabriel said, with tears in his eyes. Those words echoed in Lillian's heart like an unexpected blessing, bringing relief to years of guilt and suffering. They embraced again, trying to make up for all the lost time filled with silence and pain. By the end of that day, Billy Harburg felt more complete than ever in his life. The hardest case he had ever faced, the investigation that seemed impossible, was now over. He hadn't just reunited Gabriel, but also helped the young man understand his story, closing a chapter that had started 16 years ago. For a boy who, when found, had nothing but trash bags around him, Gabriel now had much more than he could ever imagine. He had two mothers, a father, and a friend, Billy, who had proven he would do anything for him. If you liked the story, please leave a like and check out the video showing on the screen now. I'm sure it will move you too. Enjoy the session, and see you in the next video.